The first thing to remember about scheduling your webinar is that it must be scheduled from the web portal, clicking this blue button each time. One thing to note before we get into the scheduling process, there is an option to save a webinar template. Let's click. You can save up to 40 different templates, name them whatever you want to name them, and then you can schedule using the template, which will fill in a lot of the settings so that you don't have to start over from scratch. If you choose to use a template, it will remember all of the settings except for 4 things: the date and the time, the panelists, speakers, if you have them, and survey. Otherwise, it will remember your settings and fill those in for you. We will use a template today. Let's click on Upcoming Webinars, Schedule a New Webinar. You'll have the topic or name of the webinar, as well as the description, which is optional. One thing to remember here, if you are asking people to sign up or register for the webinar, the description will appear on the registration page. Let me show you an example. Whatever you type there will appear here on the registration page, so keep that in mind. Let's go ahead and use a template so we can see what this looks like. And as you'll notice, it will fill in a lot of that information for me. I can still change it if I choose to. I don't have to leave it exactly as it's listed in the template. Let's roll down to the date and the time. You can always enter a specific time if you'd like to. And then the duration, I'm going to leave for 1 hour. This does not mean that Zoom will start the webinar automatically or that Zoom will end the webinar automatically after 1 hour. This is simply helping me with the setup of the event, letting the guests know how much time to block on their calendar for this particular webinar. Moving on to time zone, my recommendation is to leave the time zone in your personal time zone. Then we also have an option, is this a recurring webinar? Let's say yes. Under recurring, there are 4 options from the dropdown. It could be an everyday webinar, weekly, and you can check mark the days of the week, monthly, few options here, repeat, occurs, and end date. If it's a daily, weekly, or monthly webinar that you're setting up, you can choose the end date, or you can even have it repeat a certain number of times, whichever one makes sense. There's one additional option under recurring, a no fixed time webinar. This means that the webinar isn't tied to a certain date or time. I'd like to have it scheduled, and it will remain in my upcoming list of webinars so that I can start it and end it whenever I want. One thing to remember about no fixed time, you cannot ask people to register or sign up for a no fixed time webinar. It will get rid of that possibility. Let's create a daily webinar that will repeat 3 times. The next big question is about registration. If you would like to have people sign up or give you the RSVP ahead of time, you can require registration. However, you do not have to use registration for webinar. For today, let's say it is required. The next 3 options that pop up are because this is a recurring webinar. So the question I need to ask here is, how many times will I make the attendees sign up or register for the 3 events? Option 1, they can register once and come to any and all of the occurrences. Option 2, they need to register for each individual occurrence. In our case, they will need to register 3 separate times, and this will appear as a drop-down menu on the registration page. or option number 3, they can register one time and then choose to attend 1, 2, or all 3 of our occurrences. This will appear as a checkmark option, much like this on the registration page. Moving on, if you have scheduling privilege set up in your account settings, you can choose that. You can require a webinar passcode for an extra layer of security, and you can also change that passcode. Video. The only people that can turn on a video during a webinar would be the host and the panelists. Would you like them to come in with their camera automatically on or automatically off? And my recommendation, I always leave both of those to off. What are the audio options that you would like to allow for people joining into the webinar? Telephone, computer audio, or both? Webinar options. If you'd like to have the option for a Q&A panel, it must be checkmarked here every single time. So this is decided on a webinar by webinar, case by case basis. If you want the practice session, make sure that is checkmarked ahead of time. There is an option to enable HD video for screen sharing. Notice the question bubble. This will require an increased bandwidth, so something to keep in mind here. You can require authentication to join, yet another layer of security. And you can automatically record a webinar either to your computer or to the cloud. Moving on. If you need an alternative host, that means as the host, you won't be able to attend and you need someone to host the event on your behalf, you can set that up also here ahead of time. To be able to use the alternative host feature, that person needs to be a pro licensed user on the same Zoom account as the host. They do not need the webinar add-on license to become an alternative host. Finally, if you will be using language interpretation, you do have the ability to set that up ahead of time here on the scheduling page. But you can also set this up and edit this live during the webinar if you would rather do it that way. Let's click schedule. Our webinar is officially scheduled, and this is the webinar information page. From here, we will see one of our start buttons, the topic, the description, date and time. And this is a recurring webinar, so I can show all of the occurrences, and I can even edit, delete, or add more webinar sessions from here. I can add this to my calendar so that I will have a reminder. One thing to remember, this is for the host. This is not how you will invite people, and a webinar invitations are different. So remember that this will be a start link, not a join link that you are adding to your calendar. Every webinar will have an ID that's associated with it. We also chose to set up a passcode. And I will see my additional options that I chose in the setup. If I need to make a change, I can always edit this webinar. I can start the webinar also from here, and I can also save the webinar as a template. Choose a name for your template, decide if you'd like to save the recurrence, and then click Save. One more option at the bottom. You can convert a webinar to a meeting if you ever needed to do that. Let's go back to our webinar list. Now, under the upcoming webinars, I can see the list of my 3 occurrences. It is the same ID when it is a recurring webinar. And I have yet another start button from within the web portal.